Hello, this is Mario Surfero, editor-in-chief at XDA flashaholic in recovery,
And I'm Chris Gillum, senior writer for XDA.
and we'd like to welcome you to the fourth XDA Android podcast. Our goal is to cover the latest in Android tech news from an enthusiast perspective. And we're joined here today by Redditors, editors from XDA, and a special guest.
Me, hello. Normally he says Linus in our 3 dry runs, but it's okay. I'm Linus from Linus Tech Tips. I make technology videos on the YouTubes, and I upload them to other video platforms from time to time. I'm not particularly focused on phones, but they assure me that they won't make me look like an idiot on the podcast today.
My name is Anthony. I'm an AMA coordinator on the Android subreddit.
Yeah, my name's Corey Fiak. I'm from the Android subreddit. I'm also an Android developer.
Daniel Marchena from the subreddit, and I'm an Android enthusiast.
All right. So we're holding a contest on Twitter. You just have to tweet hashtag YIXDA, and you should link your favorite XDA post or thread. The prizes are a Nexus 5X or a Nexus 6P. You can get either of those just by doing that. You tweet, you enter, you're in. And with that out of the way, we're going to go straight into the topic. Corey.
Woohoo, new phones.
New phones, yes. Corey, what's our first topic?
Well, yeah, so the first thing we want to start out with is, since we have Linus on here, we were looking at the video that you posted recently, and it was testing some of the cooling with phones and how they handle. It was actually pretty interesting. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. You were actually water cooling the phones, is that right?
Well, sort of. I mean, calling it water cooling is being pretty loose with the term water cooling. Yes, there was liquid involved. Well, okay, no, I guess they're sort of water cooled, but not in a way that would be at all practical. The inspiration for this actually came from a video that it doesn't surprise me that you didn't see, where I water cooled the MacBook Retina 2015. So that's where you might have seen this idea before, but you didn't watch that. I get it. So what happened in that video, and the reason that I was so interested to see what would happen with modern flagship phones, particularly the iPhone 6s, was we discovered that when we water-cooled the 2015 MacBook, we were able to get literally double the multi-threaded performance out of the thing over a long period of time once the chip started to heat up. Double the performance, because aside from thermal throttling, and this is to my knowledge less so the case on your typical A-series or Snapdragon processor, but aside from thermal throttling on desktop or laptop CPUs and GPUs, there are also boost settings. So there's your advertised base clock speed, and then there's your boost clock speed if the thermal and power limits allow for it. So the power limits were fine on the MacBook, but that thing with no fan ran so hot that you weren't achieving any of those boost clocks. So I kind of looked at it and I went, oh, okay, well, that was really cool. I don't need to go quite as extreme as I did with the MacBook, where I actually used Art Eraser and gummed up all the ports and all the screw holes and actually put it in the water because I was only doing one device, so that kind of prep work wasn't really a huge issue. So I didn't go quite that extreme, but I put the phones in plastic bags where the bag itself is making contact with the water, the phone is touching the bag, and effectively you are carrying heat away much faster than air would be able to. And then I threw some ice in the water so that I could have some idea what temperature the water would be at, so it wouldn't warm up as I continued to run my tests.
Yeah, and obviously this is a very relevant topic because of this year's Snapdragon 810 processor. Now, that processor has gotten a lot of flack. Many enthusiasts have been defending it to death. There's been a lot of apologism. There's been a lot of misinformation regarding the versions, regarding the clock speeds, regarding what certain OEMs do to mitigate the hit issues. But the cold, well, not the cold, but the hard truth is that the Snapdragon 810 does overheat. Yeah.
Dragon.
Yeah, it does overheat. I have a OnePlus 2 right now sitting on my desk. We're actually hotspotting through that because the hotel does not want to give us proper Wi-Fi. We're at the Android BBQ right now, Big Android BBQ, and it actually runs a little hot just from hotspotting. So there's been a lot of processors this year, and many good processors. We've got the latest in the Atom series from Intel for mobile. Then we also have the Exynos 7420, which is a beastly processor, and I'm running it right here, and it's very fast. So I know that many of you guys have different experiences with processor. I know, Corey, you have an S6, so you're used to the 7420. Daniel, you have a Nexus 5, but you also a Nexus 6, but you also have an iPhone 6s. So I kind of wanted to gather your opinions on temperature and all that. And now that we have Linus here who did the actual test and he tested all these phones, we can kind of like discuss the performance. So Corey, what do you like about the Exynos 7420? How do you find the performance on that phone?
I mean, the performance is great on it with the CPU, provided that you aren't doing any multitasking. So I haven't rooted my phone, and I still have the RAM memory issue, and that definitely gets in the way of the great performance. But when I'm doing one thing, it does it well.
Yeah, obviously the RAM management is something else, but you can actually fix it if you're willing to root your phone and edit the build prop with FHA properties. But then there's also another chip that is very interesting, and it's the A9. Daniel, will you tell us what your experience with the A9 is like, not just in terms of performance, but also efficiency? And maybe we can contrast that with some of the results that Linus has been getting.
Yeah, it's the iPhone 6s. I've been super impressed with that phone. You know, I had the iPhone 6 as well, and there were times where it would get a little bit warm. But the 6s, it goes through pretty much anything with no problems. One of my games that I like to play on it to really see how hard I can push it is the new Disney Infinity 3.0 game, just because it's a very intensive game as far as memory and graphics and pretty much the whole situation. And the Nexus 6 struggles on it, but the iPhone runs through it like a champ. And as far as efficiency goes, you really don't notice too many issues with it throttling back or anything. And that's a question I wanted to ask for you, Linus, because I watched your video and it was actually really interesting for what the iPhone 6s chip was able to accomplish. Do you think that this is Apple detuning the chip so that it stays within certain specifications, or do you think that they just have their cooling on that chip so good and so efficient that water cooling it really doesn't make a big difference?
All right, so there's a couple things at play here. Number one is to say detuning is sort of to describe the process of manufacturing any CPU. Every single CPU is going to go through that process because you're going to have a curve in terms of how much power you're willing to throw through it and how much clock speed you can achieve, and it's always going to kind of go like this. So you're going to reach a point where it's like, yeah, we're willing to give it this much voltage, and maybe we'll double it. Oh, now we only get 8 more megahertz out of it, versus if we dial it all the way back here, we're actually getting 95% of what that chip will do. Then you've got to take that data and you've got to multiply it times, how many iPhones did Apple say they sold in the first weekend? 17 million, 8 million, something stupid like that.
Like that.
Yes, times however many millions of units they're making, because every single piece of silicon is going to be as unique as a snowflake that's all made as if we were trying to make them all the same, but they're not quite the same. So what's happening is a tuning process where Apple is going, okay, we could achieve this much if we were willing to strap a 4,000 milliamp hour battery and a heatsink the size of your fist to it, but we are dialing it back to fit within the form factor and the user experience that we desire. So there's how much heat the actual chip is going to output, and then the other thing is the efficiency with which the cooling solution is able to transfer that heat to the casing. And then this is always going to be a balancing act, because people don't want the phone to run hot in their hand, but they want the chip to run cool. So where's the heat going to go? So basically what Apple's done is they've tuned it so the 6S, or the A9, excuse me, the A9 in the 6S doesn't output a whole ton of heat, but still achieves much of the performance that it's capable of, because otherwise you're going to end up with a hot chassis. And then there's a third factor at play, and when you guys watched the video, which I'm assuming at least some of you did, I hope, I actually had 2 Snapdragon 810 based phones, and they behaved extraordinarily differently. So even though they're both running a Snapdragon 810, so they're both actually outputting the same amount of heat, and in theory, well, similar, because there's yields, which I just talked about, so a similar amount of heat, but the ability to transfer that heat to the chassis is dramatically different. Like, you look at the way that ZTE phone throttled. I mean, I got to wonder if there's even a heatsink in there. Whereas the metal chassis of the One M9, even though it's burning hot to the touch, and heaven forbid you ever want to make a phone call on the damn thing, it did manage to hold together more steadily for longer, depending on which run I was running, because the 810 was kind of all over the place. So I guess that's kind of where I'm going with all this. The PC industry went through this a long time ago with NetBurst and the Pentium 4. And that's basically where it feels like Qualcomm's at with the Snapdragon 810. They went too hot, too far, and now they're going to have to dial it back and get efficient, just like Intel did back in the Prescott days. So, I mean, that's the thing, is it's so funny for me watching the phone enthusiast community go through all of the same things that I've been watching the PC enthusiast community deal with for the last 15 years.
Yeah, and with that, it comes the stages of grief, of hype, too. Funny because we were hyping the 805 for so long, and then that came out, and that was great. It was, uncompromisingly good, at least in my experience. It did run a little bit hot maybe when doing intensive operations, but the frame rate didn't really suffer for me. But then, the 810 came out, and the 805 got absolutely forgotten, and this feels like a recurring topic, but it's so true. And you were saying that the 810 is all over the place, both in the phone, but also compared with other 810s. And I mean, I think that's just like the consequence of many OEMs just being sold on the 810 and then having to figure out how to keep it cool. You have the Xiaomi try to implement various thermal patterns for the Xiaomi Mi Note Pro, and that didn't work quite that well. And it definitely seems that phones running 1440p screens are the ones who suffer the most from all of this. So I want to ask about the chipgate phenomenon as well, because we were talking about OEMs trying to find this perfect efficiency ratio, but at the same time, there's variations within all chips within the chip. Some chips, even if it's the Exynos 7420, some are going to be slightly better than others because it's really hard to manufacture them, especially at the scales that we're dealing with. And that could be it. Maybe one of the reasons why Samsung's manufactured chips in the iPhone 6s had some trouble. What chip do you have on yours, Daniel? Do you know?
I have the TSMC chip on my iPhone 6s. And back to you, Linus. Regarding the chip gate, I guess is what everybody's calling it, which I think is completely blown out of proportion. Do you think that heat has anything to do with the longevity issues that people are seeing when they're running these intensive CPU benchmarks? Or do you think that it just has something to do with, like we were talking about, every chip is manufactured slightly differently?
I think it's a combination of things. Every chip is manufactured slightly differently. Like you look at what Intel's been doing. Again, I'm always going to bring things back to PC on you guys here. I'm sorry, because that's the breadth of my knowledge is a little bit stronger there.
We like to keep it PC.
Yeah. A couple generations ago, Intel stopped even rating their CPUs at a given operating voltage, and they started rating them at just a range. They said, okay, well, your chip's going to run anywhere from here to here, and anything within that spec is considered acceptable. So it's possible that Apple delivered to both TSMC and to Samsung a spec range. And it's possible that Samsung falls on the worse end of that range and TSMC falls on the better end of that range in spite of Samsung's smaller manufacturing process allowing them to make the actual die smaller, which normally translates to better power efficiency, and in this case didn't, because not everyone's like, for the longest time, people think that, okay, someone manufacturing on a 19 nanometer process, or someone manufacturing on a 45 nanometer process, or in this case, it's, if I recall correctly, I think it's 12 and 14 or something, 14 and 16, 14 and 16, I think. People assume that everyone manufacturing transistors that have this given distance, they think it's the same, but it's not. There's so much more to it. I mean, when Intel moved to FinFET, we saw a huge improvement, and that's just a way of manufacturing the chips. That's not necessarily just a size change. So depending on what kind of materials they're using, depending on a number of things that I'm sure they're not going to share with us for another 10 years for fear that their competitors figure out exactly how they're doing things. So anyway, sorry, I'm backing up a little bit. So the reason that I think people just assume that a given manufacturing process operates a certain way with the same advantages as anyone else using it is that for the longest time, Intel was a process node or two ahead of everyone else in the industry. And for the first time, and it must be 10 years or more, that's not the case. We've got TSMC and Samsung operating on a 1x sort of close to 14 nanometer manufacturing process. So we are starting to see for the first time that it's mattered significant differences between them. And that's not to say that there have never been differences before. It's just in the past, your top tier products, your CPUs, would have all been manufactured on whoever had the most state-of-the-art process. Whereas now we've got it split. We've got 3 different guys that are capable of manufacturing a state-of-the-art thing. So in the past, those trailing edge, those older manufacturing processes, you would have been making like USB chipsets with them. So who cares?
So do you think that we're at a point of almost diminishing returns regarding the process, and do you think that it's going to be, you're going to see a little bit higher net processing more efficiently and using better components, or do you think that we're going to continue the downward trend that we're going on now?
Well, I'm not a chip fabrication engineer, so I'm not qualified to jump in and say Moore's law will continue or Moore's law is dead. I know that there are a good number of people who would laugh at anyone who says that we're not going to keep shrinking transistors. I know that there's a good number of people at the hard drive companies that were saying that we're not going to keep shrinking transistors. The hard drive will remain the storage king. The news just broke this morning that Western Digital purchased SanDisk, so I guess we saw how that went for them. So the onward march towards smaller and smaller transistors does seem to be happening, but that doesn't mean that there can't be continued development with more focused chip design, even if you can't use smaller transistors. I mean, if you look at what NVIDIA did with their Kepler generation of GPUs, they enormously increased performance in games over their Maxwell, their previous generation GPUs, simply by cutting out a lot of the compute features that most of their core customer base didn't care about anyway, and by optimizing the way they were manufacturing the chip as opposed to just going, okay, well, let's just keep the previous inefficiencies and use smaller transistors in order to build in more features and more performance. So they just got a little bit smarter about it, and I think that's the thing, is I continue to have faith in the incredibly talented engineers at companies like Apple, Intel, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, and whoever else, that they're going to keep pushing performance. I'm just not 100% sure how they're going to do it.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see. I mean, there's a new range of chips coming up, and obviously the Snapdragon 820 will make or break the final opinion on so many people. Anyway, so we're talking enough about chipsets and the Exynos 7420, the A9, but there's another A9 that I think that we should talk about. HTC announced their HTC One A9. This is a very controversial phone in the sense that people are saying that it resembles, a particularly important exponent of the competition, obviously, the iPhone. And there's been a lot of talk about copying and whether it's good or not, whether design is good or not. Talk about the specifications, but there's a lot to explore with this device that HTC is trying to market as a flagship, but everything else, excluding the design at least, does not quite put it up there with the best of the rest. So I wanted to get a roundup of your opinions on this phone, and then we can talk about I think we should first talk about the specifications and then the design. We're talking about processors, and this phone has the Snapdragon 617, which is a revision to the 615, which also saw some overheating problems in some phones. Well, not quite overheating, but throttling and bad performance and battery life. So, Linus, what is your I guess superficial opinion on the A9's processing package and specifications?
It's funny that you hand that particular question over to me, because that was exactly the only point I had really planned to contribute to this phone. I think the Verge review saying that this is a phone that is more than the sum of its parts is wishful thinking. I haven't had my hands on it, so it's hard for me to say, yes it is or no it's not, but it's so hard for an Android phone maker to deliver a phone that's more than the sum of its parts these days, because they don't control the entire ecosystem, that I just have a really hard time believing it. The good news is that, particularly in the US, the price looks pretty attractive at, what is it, $399 off contract?
Yeah, but that's an introductory price only.
So introductory price of $399 off contract. It's got a good, solid looking design to it, given that it looks basically exactly like an iPhone. And as far as I'm concerned, at that price point, specs are not too bad and not too important. As a shopper, we just spent a lot of time talking about the Snapdragon 810 and the A9. But as a shopper, for myself, sure, I like having a snappy phone. But if it's for someone like my mom, I'd rather hand her something that looks and feels nice and is good enough. And I think a 617 is going to deliver that experience just fine. I just think that comparing the A9, the phone that is, the HTC A9, to something like an iPhone, where it's more than the sum of its parts, isn't really fair, because something we glossed over when we talked about the A9 chip in the iPhone. Hold this up so we know which A9 I'm talking about. Something that we glossed over is the other parts of the iPhone 6S experience that make it fast, because it's not all about the A9 processor at all. There's the NVMe-based SSD in it that's literally just a hair short of twice as fast as the storage in anyone else's flagship phone. Not to mention that almost no one has tested this, because there aren't a whole lot of Wave 2 AC devices out there. But I tested the 6S on wireless AC Wave 2 on a Ruckus R710 access point, about a $1,300 access point, to explain why most people don't have them. And this thing was pulling down 0.5 megabit on speedtest.net on Wi-Fi. It's incredible. So there's a lot more to the iPhone 6S that makes it more than the sum of its parts, whereas the A9 phone looks to me like an Android phone that's cloning the aesthetic of the iPhone in a way that's just absolutely shameless. I guess they're just taking advantage of that lawsuit ceasefire they have with Apple straight up. And if you look at the timeline, that's probably around the time this phone went into development. And that's what it looks like to me. It's an iPhone clone from a more reputable company than most of the iPhone clones, with a build quality that should be up to HTC standard and therefore better than most iPhone clones. And it should sell a handful of units because the processor is good enough and the price point looks pretty appealing.
Yeah. As far as the processor goes, I think that it's a very interesting setup what they're going for. But my problem with the phone, and I know many other people's problem with the phone, is the fact that they sacrifice function over form. They've been kind of doing this by pushing these more expensive, more premium designs and having to cut costs in other places. But with this new phone, it really shows because of the battery capacity. Now, obviously, we cannot have a spec dyslexia and just go on mindless speculation, but it is very worrying that this phone has the smallest battery in a major flagship since the Nexus 4, which again was not very well known for its battery capacity. And that's one of the things I think where vertical integration comes in and does so well and so much. It benefits the iPhone so much more, because they can manage to squeeze out the most out of their tiny battery packages. Meanwhile, the same is not possible on Android. And what worries me the most is that the 617 might not be the most efficient chip, but the most efficient chips with some of the most efficient components in Samsung phones, for example, and with bigger batteries, they still do not manage to surprise and wow. Hopefully Marshmallow can help some of that. But I know, Corey, your phone has been criticized for having not that great of a battery life, and it does have a bigger battery, not significantly bigger at least, but it has more efficient chips. How's your battery life? How do you think that the A9 would appeal to a consumer that just is interested in specifications? Because ultimately, this is a podcast about enthusiasts.
Right. So there's some problem with the battery life that people have noted, but honestly, personally, it doesn't really impact me very much due to the quick charge. I think I've discussed this before, but if I can plug it in at work for 15 minutes and get 20-30%, then having a poor battery life, it doesn't really impact me as much. But another thing I wanted to talk about too with HTC in general with this phone, HTC is changing it up, right? They're doing what we told them to do. They're moving away from their old design, moving towards a new one, trying to change it up, trying to do anything to cling back onto this premium smartphone market again. but they're failing to do it correctly, just like before. They're losing this functionality. I've had two HTC phones. I had the M7 and the M8, and the best thing about this were the speakers. Those front-facing boom sound speakers were phenomenal. This little down-firing speaker hole on my Galaxy S6 is not even close to as good sounding. And here we have, again, we're getting a mid-range phone where they're going with the iPhone style of the down-firing speakers. And I think they're losing what made the M7 and M8 so exciting. And so it's going to be very difficult to see can they transition to this new budget-minded phone, and can this save them, or are they just treading water at this point?
I think it just depends on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Linus.
I was just going to say, I think it depends on how they're hoping for this thing to sell. Because if they're hoping for it to sell in a store as, a $3.99 alternative to the iPhone, where my aunt comes in and picks it up and goes, "Wow, this looks really great and feels really great in my hand," and walks out of the door with it, then it might be a great strategy. If they are expecting, tech heads to run out and buy it, then probably not so much.
Yeah, and along your lines there, Linus, I think that one thing that HTC has never been bad at is camera software. They've always had really good camera software. It's just their cameras have sucked in the past few years. I think that if somebody sees it that goes into a store and they see it's got a decent enough camera, not the best thing in the market, but a good enough camera, a decent screen, it looks nice, it looks very similar to an iPhone. I think you're right that they may be able to capture some of that mid-market people that just walk in there and don't want to spend the $600-700 on an iPhone. Relating to battery life, though, I actually saw a tweet from Paul O'Brien on Twitter. He has the A9 and he's been using it, and he said that his battery life has been nothing short of miraculous on it. So, even though we are looking just at the specs here and we're seeing 2150 milliamp hours, that's not going to be able to do anything. Maybe HTC or Marshmallow or the 617, or maybe the combination of the trifecta of the three of them, maybe it is producing something we haven't seen in an Android phone before, something that is small but can go the whole day.
Well, I mean, the thing is that there's no black magic when it comes to, you put a less powerful processor in it, it takes longer to drain the battery. I don't want to give HTC any of this necessarily, because I sincerely doubt that they've the 617. So I would like to give the credit probably to Marshmallow in this case. And if that's the case, then great, because my Droid Turbo is going to go 2 days now legitimately as opposed to just 1 day, and that's still better for me than putting a piss poor 2150 milliamp hour battery in the damn thing.
And I've been getting close to 5 hours screen on time on my Nexus 6 on Marshmallow, so I don't know if anybody else here is running Marshmallow. It really does improve battery life considerably.
Yeah, I have a Nexus 6 on Marshmallow right here, and I think I get 4.5 to 5, so not quite as good as you, but it's pretty close enough. But I think it's because we were talking about Marshmallow for HTC devices, I think it's important to touch on the fact that HTC's been promising 15 days after Nexus devices get updates, HTC phones will get updates. I find that astounding, especially when you think of HTC. They don't run like a Motorola approach to Android. They have their own skin sense on top of it, so they have to optimize it for sense, and then they, of course, have to get carrier approval for it, or else not going to go through. I don't know are they actually selling the A9 with carriers, or are they selling it unlocked like with Motorola and the Nexus is doing?
There is carrier support in the U.S. I think Verizon said they're carrying it, and Sprint, I believe they said they're carrying it. I think those are the only two. Just some two quick notes about the software. They did say the A9, they didn't specify carriers, so I'm thinking they're going to be pinpointing carrier. Unlocked editions will be getting that 15-day agreement, and not necessarily ones we may see roll out from T-Mobile or AT&T or Sprint in the U.S.
Yeah, something that's very interesting, I think, is the fact that they're actually reportedly scaling back on Sense. Obviously, OEMs have it much easier to theme phones now with layers and whatnot and not break functionality. I think that they might be scaling back on Sense to push faster updates. It's kind of weird when you think about it, because just a few days ago they were saying that monthly security patches aren't realistic. Now it was McKenzie who said that, HTC representative, but in his defense, he did say that the problem was carriers, and the HTC A9 is it's mostly not sold. It's the sales model is attempting to be online mostly, from what I gather. So I think that could actually help, and the fact that they're scaling back on cents could actually help as well. I don't know if they're gonna manage to pull it off. I mean, they didn't pull it off with Lollipop. They actually did not meet their promise. I think it was I don't know, something like 90 days, and they did overshoot that, and they had to make a statement about it. So hopefully they managed to turn that around. I mean, manufacturers definitely see that enthusiasts like software updates. That's one of the main things I want to close this on. The enthusiast appeal. It's something that you mentioned, Linus. It doesn't seem like tech heads would go out of the way to get this phone because it's not future-proof enough, because it puts too much emphasis on form over function. But then you got this unlockable bootloader thing, which for us at XDA is a nice thing to have. And then you also have the software updates, which mostly appeal to, they mostly appeal to tech heads, or people are actually interested in Android and seeing the latest and greatest. I don't think my mom ever worried about a software update. In fact, she tells me, how can I hide this notification telling me to update? So, Linus, what's your opinion on that? Because you mentioned that before.
Yeah, well, I guess my opinion is that who cares? Because the last time, I would say, and you guys can tell me if you think I'm way off base with this, I'd say the last time tech head appeal made a phone commercially successful was probably the Nexus 5, and I don't remember the time it happened before that. So who cares what the tech heads think?
And even then, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, look at the Galaxy S6. Look at the Galaxy Note 5. The Note 5 was the biggest slap in the face to Android enthusiasts and phone tech heads that I can remember. And yet, it's getting rave reviews all over the place, and people are buying them because they don't care.
And, we're a small percentage. The enthusiast area is a very small percentage of the market. That's why Nexus devices, haven't sold, as much as their nearest competitor. And you mentioned the Nexus 5 as being a commercial success. We don't know how much of a commercial success it actually was. It's huge forums. I've seen people walking around with it, but you still see more people with M7s and M8s and Galaxy S4s and Galaxy S3 or Galaxy S5s. So how much of a commercial success it really was, I don't think we ever got sales numbers. But
really hard to say. I was just going based on that. Unlike every other tech head oriented phone, I actually would see them places from time to time.
That's true. I've seen a bunch of them.
Maybe OnePlus One might be another sort of breakout, but can you call a phone that's not even profitable a commercial success? I don't know. And then again, we don't even know how much money Google was or LG was even making on the Nexus 5. So.
Sure. And speaking of OnePlus, I think they are targeting that lower end mid-range market now with the OnePlus X. Mario, what details do you have regarding that device?
Well, some people also do say that it looks like an iPhone.
Sony.
Or a
And a Sony back, though, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like Sony.
It's a Sony 5S.
Yeah, we had the Tina leaks before, and when those came out, people actually thought that it was a picture of an iPhone that was doctored, but it was on the actual website. It was actually approved, so it was not. And that was just hilarious to me, how people were thinking, oh, it's a fake, but it's not. It's up there.
Well, in all fairness to the average person, if you walk down the street with an Android phone and you tell them, hey, we just have the release of an iPhone, come take a look, they'll believe it. That's the premise of
such an efficient strategy for many OEMs to just copy the iPhone, because it's just like the visual cues are there, and the visual cues are a great part of what makes an iPhone in the popular subconscious. At least I would argue for that. In China, I actually have a lot of people from China through XDA and on social media. They constantly post, I'm saving up for an iPhone, but for now I'm going to buy this phone that looks like an iPhone. And, there's this whole cultural status symbol. And let's not forget that OnePlus it's pretty based in China as well. So I think that this device could be good in the ways that the OnePlus 2 was not, particularly the price and offering at least not so compromised package. If the specs resemble the OnePlus One specs at a lower price and a smaller form factor, which is something that many people want, then I think that it could potentially be a good phone. Obviously, there's many details to cover. What are your opinions on it, Corey? Because you have a similar form factor.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. OnePlus has been interesting lately. I mean, the One was a pretty big hit, pretty successful. Even today, I still see people using the OnePlus One. OnePlus 2, I wouldn't call it a flagship killer. Are they going to be going after that audience with the OnePlus X? We're not sure. We don't have the specs quite yet, but I think you're hit the pin right on the head there. Hit the nail on the head, actually. In that it's really going to be about the value you can get with this device, and we're seeing that a lot with these phones, especially mid-range phones. What type of value can you get on those devices with the spec?
And that goes back to the latest HTC phone as well, which is something that we didn't talk about, is the price point. Because, yes, it's a mid-range phone, but you also have the Nexus 5X coming in at, $370-something and change for the lower-end model. So if you have a phone like the HTC or the OnePlus, you really have to put it in the price bracket of the competitors.
I just wanted to point out that I have a OnePlus One here, so it's running the same chip that the OnePlus X is going to have, a Snapdragon 801. I don't know if it's clocked the same though, but it's same processor, smaller form factor, smaller battery. But the OnePlus One I have still works perfectly fine. Doesn't have any stutters. It's running, I guess, technically outdated software. It's running Oxygen 1.0.0, so it's like not even got 5.1 yet. But it still works well. So I think the appeal to this is going to be people who wanted a OnePlus One for a slightly smaller price, but I think the form factors where they're really hitting with people, because there are plenty of people who don't want a 5.5-inch phone. So I think this is going to appeal more to people who like the OnePlus One and were disappointed with the OnePlus 2, but who want like maybe not necessarily a true upgrade to the OnePlus One, but like a substitute for when there's crashes and burns, basically.
And to take like Linus said earlier, I kind of think of who cares. With the OnePlus X, I mean, we can't forget this is running an 801. It's a good processor, but this is 2015. This 801 is an old processor. You need to remember it's not running 64-bit architecture. It's not going to have, the DDR4 or even very fast DDR3. I'm not 100% sure about the 801 specs. So this is basically repackaging old hardware. And $250 it's an appealing price. But when you've got devices like the Moto G in that price range, you've got the Idol 3, you've got the Zenfone, all of these devices have been really good devices. There's still a lot of unanswered questions with the X. Are we actually going to be able to buy this phone? The OnePlus 2, there's so few people who are actually able to purchase it. It kind of sucks. So will the OnePlus X have those same problems? Will people be able to get it? Will there be surcharges on it? Will they be doing dumb contests to get invites and stuff? There's so many uncertainties that we'll probably find out. I think it's on the 29th is their event. But for me personally, I'm kind of like, I don't really care about this phone. They haven't lived up to what they said the OnePlus 2 was going to do. And, you've broken promises. It's they've kind of broken their name for me. And it's kind of like, whatever, what next?
Well, the honeymoon's over. I mean, that's the thing about you see this, and it's not just phones, it's not just computers, it's all over the place. You see this all the time. A company goes, they make a huge investment, they make a huge splash with an awesome product with the premise of we're going to sell it at next to no margin. We're gonna treat BOM cost as though it really has anything to do with the cost of selling a phone. And then they kind of wake up and they go, oh, these things are costing us as much to make as we can charge for them. You can always lower your price, but you can never increase it. That's rule number 1 of retail that I learned from working at a store. So I guess we're kind of hamstrung now. Well, next time, let's probably not make that same mistake. So they come back to the market with a product that is in touch with reality, and no one cares because we're back with our feet on earth again. So I think that was it for OnePlus. I think they had kind of one shot at exciting us, and that was to throw a bunch of money at something and give phones away, and that's it.
That's a really good description. I didn't think about it like that.
Yeah, and I want to go back to something that we had mentioned before, and it's that in this price bracket, it's kind of like in the I don't care price bracket, because at the price point that OnePlus is trying to compete in, you maxing out the specifications and getting the appeal of the general consumer is kind of it doesn't quite matter as much as a flagship that needs to have the latest and greatest. At the same time, OnePlus cannot do what HTC could do with just putting their phones on the store and having the general consumer be fooled and thinking it's an iPhone and buy it and walk out of it and get a good experience. They have to go through the invite process. They have to go through all the, go through so many hoops just to get to their phones. You have to fight to get the privilege to buy the phone almost. And I think that's really what's going to make the biggest difference. OnePlus is really trying to push emerging markets, especially with this phone, and I think it's no surprise that they're going for a more affordable phone, that they're aiming at emerging markets, and they're trying to make all these sales on Amazon India and whatnot. So I think it's a wait and see. The specifications, the price point is likely going to be so low, the specifications are not going to be the biggest selling point. Just the price, the sliver of reputation that OnePlus has after the OnePlus 2 might be the selling point. I'm not sure if enthusiasts are going to want this phone, and I'm not sure if general consumers are going to be able to buy it or even find it. But I think it's a wait and see. It can the Snapdragon 801, it's old, but it's still good. It still is good. I think that the 800, Snapdragon 800, and the Nexus 5 was one of the most future-proof processors. So with this phone, I think it's more of a wait and see than other phones, especially because we don't know much about it.
It's really funny. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, okay. I'll just go. It's really funny that it's not quite on topic, but something you just said, the sliver of reputation that OnePlus has left. This is exactly why no one succeeds by marketing to enthusiasts, and why enthusiasts get their asses handed to them every single time by every company. Because there is no way to win by trying to please enthusiasts. The average consumer doesn't care what processor, doesn't care what brand makes their phone, quite frankly, unless it's an iPhone, because they've achieved that mass appeal. Whereas enthusiasts are going to pick you apart every time you use a Snapdragon, 895 versus a Snapdragon 9103C Revision A, and there's no brand loyalty. You guys and me as well, I mean, we're all technology enthusiasts. You can't win us over by just being super cool guys that have a great presentation on stage about your new device. You have to actually win us every single time with every single product, and if you stumble even once, then we'll just stop buying your products outright. There's no oh, well, we kind of phoned that one in, but it's okay, we'll come back swinging with the next one. So yeah, it kind of reminded me sort of the point I made about HTC coming out with that one phone and that being kind of all they had, and not being able to follow it up to the people that would care. So had they marketed a really successful phone to the mainstream and managed to have that kind of success with a mainstream audience, I bet the OnePlus 2 would be doing just fine, because those people wouldn't care anyway. Whereas if they're trying to win the market based on speeds and feeds and a low price, then they're going to have to do it over and over and over again, and that business never works.
And that's kind of...
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, and kind of expanding on what you're saying, Linus, it's kind of a double-edged sword for OnePlus, because they don't have a marketing budget. They've said it multiple times. So the enthusiast is the only way they're getting words out, but at the same time, too, it's the only community that's, stabbing them in the back because they're missing marks. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for them, unfortunately.
Exactly.
With the enthusiast market, especially, you have to strike when the iron is hot. You have to get people excited about the phone, and then they have to purchase it before the next new shiny thing comes on the market. And
Wait,
with the invite system, we don't have that. I mean, they have this phone that we're not all that excited about yet. But once we are we actually going to purchase it and get it in the cart and get the credit card charged before the next new phone comes out.
Yeah.
And the hype cycle is lost.
Yeah, and they had delays with almost every step of the way. So that also, I can imagine that also didn't help them. You know, they actually had to admit that they messed up, that they predicted, they mispredicted the appeal that it would have. And I mean, if you're gonna base your entire marketing campaign on hype, you better deliver, because that's how you're gonna lose the reputation. That's how you're gonna lose the consumer's trust. And you know, you see communities now. There's some communities that still have hope in them, but communities like Reddit, they just seemingly downvote every OnePlus submission at this point. And I think that losing that market, the enthusiast market, by just not being able to stay true to your word, and again, it's just such a hard market to please. They had the OnePlus One was great. The OnePlus 2 was not, and the OnePlus X, well, I guess that's that's what the X stands for. Yeah, I think we should be closing it because we're stretching the time, and we wanted to go about YouTube Red, but we obviously don't have time for that now. Anyway.
If you don't like that we skipped YouTube, I was gonna say, if you don't like that we skipped out YouTube Red, let us know.
But besides not hitting YouTube Red, I think we have hit a lot of topics today. We spent about the first half of the discussion talking about a couple new phones out there that happen to look like iPhones, talking about the specs, the processors. We had Linus comparing to desktop processor market, and that was a really interesting perspective to add to things, and it seems like we're seeing some patterns there. And then the second half of the show, we're talking about, well, does any of this even matter? You know, do the specs of the phone actually even have any bearing into how successful the company is? So really talking about how a company conducts itself, how they choose to market their phones. There's more to it than specs. As tech heads, we can get distracted in those things. So really interesting, captivating conversation, and I think a lot of it definitely due to Linus. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. It was a real treat to be asked. It's funny, I've had a lot of guests on my podcast, and I don't think any of them have ever actually invited me to join theirs. So either they hate me, or there's like an internet-wide conspiracy that, you know, the phone people don't seem to have heard about, you know, in time to avoid inviting me on their podcast. So thank you very much for having me on. It was a total pleasure to meet all of you and to be a guest on the show.
So with that, we're doing the outros. Mario Serafero, editor-in-chief at xdadevelopers.com/Hurricane Recovery. You can find me on xdadevelopers.com. I'm usually editing behind the scenes or publishing articles. You can find me in there. You can find me on Reddit, u/TechYoungGun. You can find me on Twitter as well. Then we got Chris Gilliam,
as senior writer for XDA. You can also find me on xda-developers.com or on Twitter and Reddit as Silicon_Reverie.
Yeah, my name's Anthony, AMA coordinator on the Android subreddit. You can find me on Reddit or on Twitter at my handle, Anthony V. Artis.
Yeah, I'm Corey Fiac. You can find my apps in the Play Store at Codisms, and you can find me on Twitter at CodismsDev.
Daniel Marchena from the subreddit. My handle's Ultimax98 pretty much everywhere.
And I'm Linus, and you can find me on your face, but only when I'm done.
Right. All right, guys. See you next time.